This is the Human Action Podcast, where we debunk the economic, political, and even cultural myths of the days. Here's your host, Dr. Bob Murphy.
Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the Human Action Podcast. Today I'm going to be going solo, talking about the recent Trump allusions to the fact that, hey, maybe we could get rid of the income tax and replace it with a tariff. And so we'll get into that this episode. But before we talk about that, let me mention this announcement. The state has a stranglehold on education. From kindergarten to postgraduate programs in public institutions, students are indoctrinated with state narratives, wokeism, and the virtues of economic interventionism. Education is a critical arena in the battle of ideas. It's why the Mises Institute is dedicated to teaching and promoting Austrian economics, individual freedom, honest history, and international peace in the tradition of Ludwig von Mises and Murray Rothbard. The only way to achieve a free society is by countering, reversing, and replacing state propaganda with sound economics and critical thinking. Join the Mises Institute for a fifth year in a row in Tampa, Florida on Saturday, February 22nd for an event on educating for liberty. Speakers include Tom DiLorenzo, president of the Mises Institute, Jonathan Newman, Mises Henry Hazlitt Research Fellow, Timothy Terrell, Mises Senior Fellow and T.B. Stackhouse Professor of Economics at Wilford College, and Jason Jewell, Chief Academic Officer of the Florida University System. Tickets are $70 for Mises members and $75 for non-members. So again, that's in Tampa, Florida, Saturday, February 22nd. For more information, go to Mises.org/Tampa25 and use promo code ACTION25. Again, go to Mises.org/Tampa25 and use the promo code ACTION25, and that'll get you 10% off the ticket price. Okay, folks, so again, this episode, what I want to focus on is Donald Trump's recent remarks suggesting that the U.S. is poised to switch away from reliance on income taxes and rely on a tariff. So let me go ahead and play a clip just so you know exactly what the context is, and then I will respond.
America is going to be very rich again, and it's going to happen very quickly. It's time for the United States to return to the system that made us richer and more powerful than ever before. Do you know the United States in 1870 to 1913, all tariffs, and that was the richest period in the history of the United States, relatively speaking. In other words, relatively. And they set up the Great Tariff Commission of 1887, and this commission had one function: what to do with all the money that we took in. It was so enormous that they had no idea. It was a blue ribbon committee. It was set up 1887, and what to do with all of the money that we had.
All right, so there you have it. So big picture, my reaction to this is, number one, I think it's amazing that this is now on the table and we're talking about this. The things Trump has done, as I'm recording this, we're halfway through his second week in office, and it's just jaw-dropping how fast he's moving. So I love the fact that the president of the United States is talking like this and floating the idea of getting rid of the income tax. That's amazing. My concern, though, is with the way the numbers are right now, it may be misleading Americans to hear Trump talk like that, in particular the stuff about, there was this blue ribbon commission back in 1887 and all this, so much revenue was coming in from the tariff, they didn't even know what to do with it. And I think that's leading some Americans to believe that, all we have to do is just switch the source and we can fund everything that the government does. Maybe we'll get some programs we don't need here or there, trim the fat, but basically we can just switch over from taxing U.S. income to taxing foreign imports, and that's really all we got to do. And it's just a switch over. And I want to say, no, the numbers, they're not even close to make that work. That you would have to drastically cut federal spending in order for the switch in revenue source to possibly be viable. All right, so when I mentioned this on social media, there were lots of both libertarian and more traditional conservative types who were in favor of, very happy about what Trump was saying here. And they were like, yeah, Bob, that's great. Isn't that what you want? Yes, it is what I want. But my concern is if you sell this plan leading people to believe it, spending cuts are a separate thing that Doge can deal with, but over here we're just talking about the revenue source and we're just going to switch from income to tariffs without people realizing just that by itself is not going to work, it could discredit the reform. And it's particularly ironic because as I was having this feud with some of the Trump fans on this issue, more generally, and again, it could be different individuals, but the Trump defenders were out there in the trenches responding to accusations that, with his pause on federal spending, that Medicaid recipients now were missing out on treatment. And they were, the Trump people were going out and clarifying and saying, no, this is a bull-faced lie. And it's not at all the case that the Trump administration has turned off Medicaid funding and right. So my point is simply the type of federal spending cuts that would need to happen in order to switch from reliance on an income tax to a tariff would be politically unpopular with lots of people. There would have to be, it's not just cutting waste, fraud, and abuse. There would have to be serious cuts in things that average Americans get, not just $50 million and sending condoms to Gaza or whatever crazy, spending program, or studying the mating habits of this gerbil that lives in this zip code or something. That no, it would have to be serious cuts in the money that's flowing out of Washington into the hands of large constituencies. All right. And again, I support that as a radical Rothbardian, but my point is it's not simply like, we're going to go ahead and push through our reform, and then some people will have to learn about the details later, that again could discredit the reform. That's my concern, that if you're not upfront with people, whereas again, Trump has all of this groundswell of support, doing all this stuff, deporting criminal, illegal immigrants and all this stuff, and everybody's all gung-ho about these various things. And so if he, while talking about switching from taxing American income to taxing imports, if he said, now this is only going to work, my advisors are showing me the numbers here, folks, this is only going to work if we have some serious belt tightening and we're going to do this and this, that would be amazing. But if he just doesn't even talk about that, instead dwells on, back in 1887, they had so much revenue flowing in, that's very misleading at the least. Okay. So that's my issue. Let me also say, before I jump into the particulars with the numbers, in general, if you could cut federal spending enough such that you could switch over and feasibly fund the remaining government spending activities with tariffs instead of relying on an income tax and get rid of the IRS altogether, I would love that. That I think economically it would be beneficial. But also the big kicker is just the restoration of privacy, right? That when the federal government taxes your income, the problem isn't simply the marginal disincentive to generating extra income because of that distortion, but no, they need records on all of your business. Like literally, they're totally in your business in order for them to calculate how much income you generated and then to determine this is how much we think you owe us. Okay, so that's another huge virtue of taxing taxing imports rather than income generation, is that it's much less invasive of privacy. And so for that reason alone, I like it. But notice there, you only get that benefit if you completely get rid of the income tax. So I was recently interviewing Brian Dimitrovic, and he mentioned how Steve Forbes was pushing an idea of, hey, let's go to a flat 15% income tax and 15% tariff rate. Just kind of across the board. Hey, we're taxing everything at 15%. And I agree, if it's a choice between the status quo and that, I definitely like that better than what we're doing right now in terms of like the supply side benefits of that approach. But that would not get you the benefit of abolishing the IRS and getting the government out of everybody's personal financial activities, right? So I'm, again, just stressing that's why I think these things are important. And the MAGA fans should not be touting this proposal promising people, oh, imagine getting rid of the IRS when, unless there are drastic spending cuts going along with this, that's not going to happen. Okay. As a matter of historical record, the irony is when the U.S. introduced the income tax in 1913, part of the pitch was that, oh, we're going to get rid of this broad-based tax on consumption, which is what the tariffs did historically, that everybody has to pay, the working class has to pay. We're going to phase out our reliance on that, and instead we're going to bring in this income tax, which can be more scientifically deployed, and we can limit the impact. We can just tax the wealthy, for example, and that was how it was sold originally, that this is just going to be a tax on the ultra wealthy. And, the working class can be spared the ravages of federal taxation by by phasing out the tariff. And of course, as people who know the history realize, that went out the window, that the top marginal tax rate skyrocketed just a few years later as the U.S. was in World War I. And then going into the Great Depression, you had the Smoot-Hawley tariff of 1930 that was the highest tariff rate in U.S. history up to that point. And you still had enormous marginal income tax rates as well, right? So it was a double whammy. So again, my concern is that you might end up with the worst of both worlds here, where if we bring in high tariff rates with the allure of, oh yeah, don't worry, we'll cut the income tax in exchange, and then, oh yeah, but there's a mismatch right now, just we couldn't possibly forfeit that much revenue, let's just have both for a bit. That promised income tax phase out isn't going to happen. So that's what I'm trying to guard against here. Okay. So let me show you this chart. So what you're looking at here, this isn't from an academic paper. I just grabbed this off of Wikimedia. I spot checked some of these numbers, and it's basically right. It's a little bit off. Well, it's a lot off in the Civil War era, because there was an income tax temporarily, and it's not denoting it like that. But in any event, this just gives you an idea of why people like me are trying to pump the brakes a bit amidst all of this excitement about, oh, why don't we just tax foreigners when they're trying to sell us stuff rather than taxing U.S. workers when they're generating income. And this is why, that you can see, and this, what this is measuring is as a percent of GDP, right? As a share of the economy. And so historically, and also notice this yellow shaded region, that's not simply tariffs, that's tariffs and excise taxes. So that also includes, in the U.S., there were excise taxes like on alcohol and tobacco, for example, right? And so I think, rule of thumb, I think maybe the tariffs were like 2/3 of that, and the excise taxes on domestic stuff were about 1/3. Okay, so as you can see, call it 2 to 3% tops historically of GDP was raised through tariffs. Whereas if you look now at the right-hand side of this chart, you can see that a good 10% of GDP is raised by the income tax, which I think is merging the corporate and the personal. And then another 5 to 6% is from the payroll tax. And currently, it's only a minuscule portion is raised by tariffs and domestic excise taxes. Okay, so again, just looking at right now, the proportion of the budget being brought in, and this kind of underscores what I was saying, that clip I played from Trump is potentially very misleading if you thought he was saying, see, so if we just did what we did back in 1887, we're going to have gushers of money and we can just get rid of the income tax. Well, no, because back in 1887, the tariff was only bringing in 2 to 3% of GDP. All right, the federal government didn't spend very much back then. In big picture, that's why I would argue the era of the United States where the government raised revenue primarily through a tariff, an external tariff, was associated with a very robust economic growth. It wasn't because the tariff is such a great method of taxation. It was because they didn't tax very much. And in fairness, partly it's because the tariff does have like a built-in escape valve that ultimately if the tariff rate gets to be too high, then people just switch away from buying imports and they buy domestically. Whereas if the income tax rate is raised, there's not as much that people can substitute into. Or it's not like, oh, instead of earning income, why don't we go do something else instead? Even there are some things you can do. Like there's different ways of generating income. You can switch to tax exempt occupations and so forth. And there's things like if you take your pay in the form of the corporation having a nicer office building or giving you more generous health benefits in terms of a corporate plan, which under the current tax code is not treated as taxable income. I mean, so there still are things like that where, yeah, if the tax rate on basic income gets to be punitively high, there's ways that people can react to that and shift out and kind of earn their, quote, income in different ways that escape the tax. But still, that's nothing compared to if the tariff rate gets to be too high, people just stop buying imports and they switch to domestic goods. All right. So in that sense, I agree the tariff is a safer way to raise revenue because there's built-in ways that it maxes out. Okay. But again, having said all that, my point simply is this chart, I think, underscores right now, if the U.S. government is going to pivot away from income taxes and rely more heavily on tariffs, it's going to have to be accompanied by large spending cuts because otherwise, you're just not going to bring in the same amount of revenue. It's not even close. And also, I wanted you to see this chart to show, I think a lot of people, when they think income tax, they think, oh yeah, everything that the government takes out of my paycheck. And I want to be clear that the way policy wonks talk about this stuff, the payroll tax is not the income tax. Right? So the payroll tax refers to, FICA, that it's your, quote, contributions to Social Security and Medicare. Right. So that's handled differently, and that is not included in the umbrella of the income tax. And also, by the way, when it comes to arguments about the rich paying their fair share, and you might hear defenders of small government saying things like, oh, well, that's crazy. The rich already pay a huge portion of the income tax at the federal level. And they could throw out statistics. I don't know them off the top of my head. I didn't review them, but the top 10% of earners pay, some large percentage of all income tax. And in fact, the bottom 47% or whatever it is don't pay any income tax. Whatever those figures are, that is talking about the income tax narrowly, right? So even poor workers in the bottom quintile, they still have money taken out of their paychecks, every check, to fund Social Security and Medicare. That's a payroll tax, right? So keep that in mind as well, that if people are talking about the tariff phasing out the income tax, we should not be leading workers to believe when you get your pay stub, you're going to see no deductions anymore at the federal level. That's not the case unless you also mean, we're going to get rid of the payroll tax too, in which case you can see the gap is even that much bigger in terms of how could a tariff possibly replace that. Okay. Another way of seeing the difficulty, because the one response might be, okay, sure, back in 1887 or whatever, and historically, maybe the tariff only brought in 2% of GDP in terms of revenue, but why couldn't it just be more? Right? The fact that they didn't bring in that much back then, they could still do more now, especially hasn't there been more globalization? And yes, that is true. But for example, Jeremy Kaufman tweeted this out just a couple days ago on the same context. And he said that right now the income tax brings in about $2.5 trillion in receipts, whereas the total value of imports is about $3.8 trillion. And so he was just trying to show. So if you needed to raise $2.5 trillion of revenue on that base of the imports, like the tariff rate would have to be like 65%, whereas right now it's like 2% or something. Okay. And so his point was, that's assuming too that the volume of imports don't fall And you would think with that huge punitive rate that they would. Now, in fairness, if you got rid of the income tax, the base of imports would go way up. So would exports too, right? All right, so the U.S. economy would, other things equal, would be much bigger. And so there'd be a larger base of imports such that a given rate would bring in more revenues from the tariff than in the absence of the income tax cut. Okay, so that would be offsetting that somewhat. But still, to give a $2.5 trillion income tax cut, let's say that raised income $5 trillion, right? Because it's just the incentive effect and the fact that, there's a deadweight loss from taxation. Of that extra $5 trillion, it's not that all of it would get spent on imports, right? Maybe $1.5 trillion would or something. Okay, so maybe imports, instead of being 3.8 trillion, would be 5.5 or something like that, right? So you can still see the rate would have to be a lot higher. And again, you get into this problem of the higher you jack up the rate, then people shift out of imports and they buy domestically. And so then there's a point at which, you hit the Laffer point, if you want to use that terminology, where jacking up the rate isn't going to bring in more revenue via the tariff. It's just going to reduce the amount of imports. And ironically, that's part of the rationale for it, right? That it seems the Trump supporters in their advocacy of tariffs are saying two things that they're not mutually exclusive, but they're competing goals. On the one hand, it's like, oh yeah, we want to have really high protective tariff rates to wean Americans from the reliance on cheap garbage from China and buying, high quality products from American producers. And on the other hand, oh yeah, we're going to get rid of the IRS because we're going to impose this tariff and bring in all this revenue that China's going to pay for. Right. And it's, well, which is it? Right. Again, I'm not saying it's got to be completely one or the other, but those two goals, to the extent that this high tariff rate discourages Americans from importing goods and switching to domestic producers, that's not generating tariff revenue then. Okay. So again, just want people to go in this with eyes open. All right. Let me, and by the way, I'll link. So I have earlier done an episode on a standard mainstream economic analysis in terms of tax policy and just the pros and cons of raising revenue via tariffs versus income taxes. And just real briefly here, I'll just give some of the high level summary. I was saying that in general, economists think that a consumption tax is more efficient, or is a better way to raise revenue without hurting the economy, without causing as many distortions, is taxing income. That's why a lot of economists favor a national sales tax or a VAT. You may have heard of that, and think that's better than an income tax. And the way to see that is the deal with an income tax. It doesn't just penalize today's consumption. But if you take, you earn income today, and then if you want to defer consumption, so you want to save some of the income, well, then that generates more income in the future in the form of interest or dividends or capital gains if you're, buying shares of stock or something, right? So if those forms of income are also taxed, and they are right now under our code, then the income tax, it's not merely that it's taxing consumption, it's also taxing savings, right? So it's deadening the incentive to save. It's muting the benefits of saving. And so the income tax penalizes capital formation and saving more than a consumption tax would. And so again, that's part of the rationale for why economists in general, when they're doing this kind of tax analysis, would say, other things equal, if you got to raise $1 trillion, it'd be better to do it on consumption rather than on income. And so in that respect, you might favor a tariff over an income tax because a tariff is closer to a consumption tax than an income tax is. However, there's a countervailing consideration. Another principle in standard tax analysis is that you want to tax something with as big a base as possible so that you can have that marginal rate be as low as possible to raise whatever the desired revenue target is. Right. So if you want to raise $1 trillion and you're going to levy it on consumption, you would want to tax all kinds of consumption equally to get the rate as low as possible. You wouldn't want to just tax the goods that start with the letters A through M at a high rate and then tax the goods that start with the letters N through Z at a 0% rate, right? That because then as the rate gets higher, that introduces more distortion. Because the problem with taxing is that transactions that are win-win end up not occurring because of that extra disincentive. Like that, in terms of standard economic analysis, that's the problem with taxing. That's what leads to what's called a deadweight loss, if you've ever seen economists use that term. Okay, so the higher the rate, the more that type of thing happens where transactions just don't occur, in which case nobody benefits from that, right? The tax man doesn't even get the revenue from that if the transaction doesn't occur. So that's why, again, you have this general principle that given the government needs to raise revenue, one principle it should keep in mind is try to tax as broad a base as possible to keep that rate low so that you're not discouraging too many transactions. So with that in mind, then you say, oh, what's the difference between taxing foreign imports versus domestic income? Well, the base on foreign imports is lower than domestic income. So to raise a given amount of revenue in dollar terms, the rate you would have to apply on the imports is higher than what you'd have to apply in domestic income production. And so for that reason, so anyway, I go through all that stuff. I'll put a link if you want to see me spell that out more fully. But again, my conclusion was if you could reduce spending enough so that desired target revenue was low enough that a tariff could work, then I would totally favor switching over. Okay, let me now switch gears a little bit here. I was doing research on this stuff, and I came across an article in Forbes by Brian Dimitrovic, who is a scholar with the Laffer Center, so Arthur Laffer. And he had this Forbes article on January 11th, and he had this intriguing paragraph here. So let me just read this to you folks, and then I'll just comment a bit on this and we'll wrap up. So this is Brian. It is incredible to see all the proofs that economists have on the excellence of free trade. They seem not to be aware of how good they are. We know this because the economists do not apply the same proofs to the income tax. If they really believed their proofs, and they should, they would apply them to the income tax and become a noisy gong for a zero income tax. All right, I'm skipping a little bit. What remains unclear, and the sticking point, is why we have the term free trade. To the extent we do, and we most certainly do, the supply-siders ask, what about free income? Okay, so what Brian's getting at there is in the economics profession, and not just among like radical libertarians, but even among more mainstream economists, there has been a long tradition of free traders, right? And that's trader with a D, not traitor with a T, as some of the MAGA people might allege, right? So economists spend a lot of time preaching the virtues of free trade and explaining why tariffs are bad. And I did this too. When I read Brian's article, I was like, yeah, that is true. And when I used to teach at Hillsdale College, the intro micro classes, I would spend a long time going over the case for free trade. Going over Henry George had his wry observation that in times of war, we do to the enemy, in terms of blockading them and not letting goods get in, what we do to ourselves in peacetime, right? And so that's kind of interesting. Like, how come we're not helping our enemy create jobs and give their workers wage increases when we put a naval blockade on them? And yet that's the logic we use when we're, quote, protecting ourselves from cheap foreign imports during peacetime, right? And there's lots of demonstrations. I would bring the box of colored chalk into the classroom. and I would draw these nice diagrams showing the effects of imposing a tariff. And then, you got the world price here. And then when you impose the tariff, the price to domestic consumers goes up. And so we can shade in here on the diagram and show the loss of consumer surplus. And then there's gains to some other groups. For example, the domestic producers have some gains, and you can, on the diagram, color that in different colors. And the government gets some tariff revenue, and you can do that. And then, but look at the shaded region that's the consumer's loss is bigger than the gains to the domestic producers and the tariff receipts to the government. And then, they're like two trapezoids or triangles or whatever, I forget which now, that are unaccounted for, right? Like that's part of the consumer's loss, but not anybody else's gain. And that's the deadweight loss of the tariff. And so the way you summarize that is to say, the tariff creates winners and losers, but the losses to the losers are bigger than the gains to the winners. And that's why economists think a tariff is inefficient. So as Brian said, there's nothing wrong with that demonstration. That is true. But the point is, I never went into the classroom and spent weeks talking about the problems of income taxation. I didn't take out the chalk and draw diagrams on the board showing when the government raises income taxes, these are all the bad things that happen. And that, there's workers who would have gone to work and it would have been, gains to the producer and gains to the worker and gains to the consumers that buy the products they produce. And now because of the income tax, the worker doesn't work as many hours, or instead of going, to a certain type of job, they do something else that doesn't pay as much, but it's less stressful. And I wasn't, I did actually discuss some of that. I wasn't completely one-sided, but I didn't spend as much time on that. And certainly, as Brian points out, there is not a slogan among economists to say, I'm a free laborer, meaning I think that labor should not be taxed. Even though you might think, in general, if you were going to pick some element of the economy and say that should remain untaxed, it wouldn't be international trade. You would think surely not taxing labor. Like how come labor unions don't have this constituency? How come they don't fund a bunch of research among, union economists who are for not taxing unions and having those economists walking around saying we're free laborers instead of free traders? And you don't see that, right? So why is that? That's interesting. All right. So Brian has his own theory. Again, I just recently interviewed him on a different podcast, but he thinks it's just because historically, in the United States at least, the tariff was the main source of revenue for the U.S. government, and that was the thing that wonks argued about. And so when the economics profession came into its own, its contribution was to oppose the tariff, and then they recommended in its place this newfangled income tax that they could get all wonky with and, do social engineering and so on in the progressive era. All right. And I think, there definitely is part of that. However, I will say, in defense of the economists and what happened historically, I think part of it is everybody knows taxing income is at best a necessary evil, right? People don't like paying income taxes and they know that that's onerous. Whereas with tariffs, there has always been a school of thought, and you see it to this day, right? Even recently, Vivek Ramaswamy and Charlie Kirk were going around before the election arguing with college students. And, I even saw a clip of a self-described libertarian Austrian fan get up and challenge them on tariffs and say, I don't like Trump's idea of raising tariffs. And they weren't saying, we got to raise revenue somehow, it's a necessary evil. No, they were talking about all the benefits of a tariff. It's even called sometimes a protective tariff, right? So I think that's why economists historically have devoted so much time to discrediting tariffs and coming up with all kinds of thought experiments and so forth to try to demonstrate why a tariff makes your country poorer on net, is because there's been the opposite narrative coming from, originally like the old school mercantilists, and then even into our day, various unions and whatnot, trying to make the case that, a tariff, it's not a necessary evil to raise revenue. It's actually good. It makes U.S. workers richer. And don't we want to create jobs at home and so forth? And so that I think that's partly to answer Brian's question as to why is it that economists spend so much of their, intellectual resources battling the idea of tariffs being good. Okay, well, I think that is a good spot to wrap up. So again, big picture conclusion. I am intrigued and excited that Trump is pushing on this idea of why don't we get rid of the IRS and use tariffs to fund the difference. I just would like him sooner rather than later, if he's going to keep this, pursue this path, to explain to people, and this is why, if you want to make this work, buckle up, because we're really going to need to slash spending. Because if we don't, federal debt will just go through the roof, and or we'll have to run the printing press. And if you thought eggs are expensive right now, wait till you see what happens when we're printing an extra $2 trillion a year just because, this mismatch in the receipts. All right. So I think that would be the best of all possible worlds if Trump seizes this moment to explain to people, yep, we're going to get rid of the IRS for you, but you're going to have to be okay with your favorite government program getting gutted. So there you go. Okay, folks, thanks for your attention. See you next time.
Check back next week for a new episode of the Human Action Podcast. In the meantime, you can find more content like this on Mises.org.